morning, everyone. My name is Sunny Lee, and I'm here with my partner, Lillian Griffin. We will be discussing the memory of conversation and examination into the impacts of bilingualism. Our advisors are Dr. Connell and Dr. Ducius. So we would like to start, yes, please. We would like to start with the background of our research. So in our daily life, we talk to each other and interact with each other. So our memories of interactions serve as the foundation of our daily communications and our relationship buildings. However, studies related to people's conversational memory showed a poor performance of our recall. According to Stafford and Daly 1984 study, people recalled only 10% of a conversation with a stranger, even 5 minutes after the interaction. So the number and finding were shocking. They gave us an idea about how poor our conversational memory is. However, we found that studies in this field are typically conducted with monolingual participants. But in the United States alone, over 67 million people, or about 22% of the population, speaks more than one language. Because of this, we wanted to investigate how is memory of conversation impacted when the conversation is in the person's second language. So now Lily will introduce the method in our project.
Okay, so before we get started with the methods of how we based our study, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Stafford and Daly study, because this is what we kind of modeled our study after. So in the Stafford and Daly experiment that was conducted in 1984, I believe, two randomly assigned college students were asked to have a 7-minute conversation. So they were brought into a room and the experimenter told them, all right, you're gonna have 7 minutes to have this conversation, and I'll be back in 7 minutes. So after this conversation, the participants were taken to a separate room and they were shown a short distractor film. It actually was a 5-minute video, tourist video about Hawaii. So it had hopefully nothing to do with the conversation that they had just been having. And then after that, the two participants were brought into separate rooms and one was asked to recall their conversation orally. So they were given a microphone and told just talk for 7 minutes about what conversation you had, and the other participant was asked to write down everything that they remember about the conversation. So, and again, they were both separate, so this was done completely individually. So in this study, they found that, as Sunny had mentioned before, after 5 minutes of a distractor task, people are usually only able to recall about 10% of the conversation they had. And they also found that the mode in which they were asked to recall the information had affected the amount of information that they did recall. And kind of their big takeaway from this entire study was that participants recalled more of their partner statements, than their own. So we based our study off of this because we had a 7-minute conversation that happened. We had a distractor task, and we also used a very similar coding scheme to what Stafford and Daly used, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about when I get into the methods. But again, before I get into the methods, there is a very important translational impact in this study because as much of the world is bi or multilingual, studies of such as these are important in the forensic linguistic field because if you're in a different country or you're like speaking your second language and something happens where you have to go talk to a judge or like, God forbid, there was some sort of like crime that happened and you had to like talk about what you saw and what happened, it's really important to understand how your memory of a conversation is impacted by speaking in your first or second language, because that's going to have implications for plea bargains and how trustworthy your statement is to a jury or a judge or something like that. So for our methods, first to talk about our participants, Sunny worked in recruiting bilingual participants from China. So these participants were proficient in both Chinese and English, with Chinese being their first language. And she was able to recruit 20 participants. And this study was completed completely on Zoom. So then I was in charge of the monolingual participants. I recruited these participants from the US and they were proficient in English, but they did have knowledge of other languages. Just due to our plans with recruiting, I was supposed to be working with bilingual participants from Spain as well. I had a bit of trouble with recruiting in Spain and the US, so I was only able to recruit 6 participants, but that's also something we're going to talk about a little bit more later in the presentation. So this is an example of what our participants saw when they were asked to complete their main task. So we had 2 randomly assigned people on Zoom, and they were asked to have a conversation about a deserted island. So they were told that they were to explore and document what they had found on this newly inhabited, unexplored island. And so for their research, they were provided with a paper, pencils, and a camera. And survival, they were supplied with a knife, an axe, and matches. And they were told there's fresh water and everything like that on this island with no electricity. And one participant was put in charge of food and water, and the other participant was put in charge of shelter and safety. So then they were asked to talk for 7 minutes about which objects they would like to bring. So they were allowed to bring 10 objects in total, but the catch with this was that they were each only allowed to bring 5 objects. And within that, they were the only ones who could use that object. So they really kind of had to discuss and have like a true conversation about which objects would be more important for their use in either like being in charge of food and water or being in charge of shelter and safety. So as I said, that was the main task in this conversation. So after this main task, which was 7 minutes, they were asked to complete a distractor task. So we chose to make this a lexical decision task just because it lasts around 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the participant. So we kept that kind of similar to what Stafford and Daly did. And also this task we know is completely unrelated because they're asked to like look at a string of words and decide if it is a true English word or not. So after this distractor task, we completed a free and queued recall. So in our free recall, they were asked to just type out everything that they remember about the conversation, similar to what one participant did in the Stafford and Daly experiment. And then we also had a queued recall where the experimenter asked scripted questions to the participants. And we asked them questions like, who chose this object? And do you remember why your partner chose this object? And this was just to prompt them to respond to questions about what was happening in the conversation, but also, as I'm sure Sunny can also attest to, there were definitely some participants who kind of dominated a conversation. So we wanted to ask scripted questions to make sure that we were able to kind of get equal amounts of statements from each participant. So after we did all this, we had proficiency measures just to ensure that the bilingual participants we were completing the study with were actually proficient in the languages that they said they were. So we completed an operational span task, a picture naming task, and a category fluency task. So the operational span task is very important to the study because it kind of looks at how your working memory, like how strong your working memory is. So that was good to know just based on this being a memory study, but also for proficiency. And then a picture naming task, participants just saw a picture on the screen, and they were asked to just as quickly and as accurately as they could say what the picture was. And then for the category fluency task, a broad category such as tools, furniture, or fruit was put on the screen, and the participants were given 30 seconds to name as many objects in that category as they could. So to talk about the results that we found based on all of this, I do want to mention that we haven't completed coding all of this, so this is not complete, but it's as much as we've gotten to so far. It is quite a tedious task coding all of this. So as you can see, when coding the queued recall, the statements the participants made were coded based on who the subject of the statement was. So this could have either been a self statement, a partner statement, so something that their partner said, or a self and partner statement, so that was kind of like a combined idea, or a neutral statement. And then we also coded them based on the type of reproduction, so whether or not it was an error or an accurate reproduction. And this is modeled after the Stafford and Daly experiment. So with the monolingual English speakers, again, there were 6 participants used in this. We found that based on like this data, you can see there's a pretty equal number of partner and self reproductions. And this is because the way that we asked the cued recall questions, we tried to make sure there would be an equal number of these. But as you can see, it's very clear that the monolingual English speakers do make more errors when talking about their partner statements versus their self statements. And this is something we do want to examine a little bit further with our free recall, just because this is contrary to what Stafford and Daly found. And so this could be because of the modes of how we collected the data or something like that, but that is certainly something we want to examine further. And so now I'll turn it over to Sunny so that she can talk about her part of the data.
Yeah, so if we look at the data from the conversation in bilingual second language, which is the second row of our table, although it seems like they produce more bilinguals produce more statement about what they said than what their partner said, because the 49% is higher than 40%. This difference wasn't significant, which means they remembered about equal proportion of the ideas said by them and by their partners. But if you look at the errors our bilingual participant made, opposite to what Lillian has found in the monolingual data, this bilingual participant made more errors when they recall self-statements than their partner statements. So this suggests that our bilingual speakers may be focusing on their interlocutor statements during the conversation. And we speculated this at first because bilinguals would pay more attention to what their partner is saying during the conversation and dissecting the meanings of the statement during the conversation. But in order to clarify this, we still need to code the cued recall data in their native language, which is Chinese, and we haven't got there yet. So to summarize our cued recall data, monolingual speakers make more errors when recalling their partner statements, and bilingual speakers make more errors when recalling their own statements. Next slide, please. Thank you. So from the time I graduated until now, I had the time to work on the bilingual free recall data. And originally I had 20 participants, but now I had to exclude 2 participants because they only gave us an overview of the conversation without providing any content of the conversation. And again, there are all L1 Chinese, L2 English speakers. So the issue addressed in the free recall data was the amount of recall by our bilinguals. And the amount of content recalled was computed as the percentage of idea units recalled in a conversation. So we divided all the sentences in the conversation into idea units, which is the smallest unit of meaning that had informational value. And each unit represents a gist of each thought expressed by our participant. So after we calculated the percentage of idea units recalled from our bilinguals L2 and L1 conversation, the mean proportion of idea units recalled from their L1 conversation was 44%. And while the mean proportion of idea units recalled from their L2 conversation was 32%. What's more, when we ran a two-sample t-test to test if this difference is meaningful, the p-value was 0.043, which suggests that Chinese English bilinguals recall significantly more content in conversations in their L1 than in their L2. And this significant data actually showed us the impact of bilingualism on bilinguals' conversational memory, which is the question we wanted to answer at the beginning of our presentation and our project. And also, as you might have noted, the percentage we have here are higher than the data from our previous research, which was like 10% from Stafford and Daly's research. And that's probably due to the way we ran our experiment or the way we coded our data. So first of all, we mentioned the recall task before their conversation task happens. So this might allow our participants to intentionally memorize the content of the conversation before the recall. and thus resulted a higher percentage of recall. And in addition, for the purpose of our research, we only focused on how much participants remember about their decision-making process. So for the recall sentences that help conversation to proceed, such as I know, or sentences like, do you want to go first? I can go first, and so on. We didn't code them as zero or miss of recall if the participant didn't recall them, since they're not about the content or the decision-making process during the conversation. Therefore, our experiment procedure and coding scheme might affect the result to be higher than the ones in the previous research. Yet it's still surprising that only from about 32% to 44% of the conversational content were remembered by our bilingual participants. So the next step for our data may be to further divide our free recall idea units into partner or self statements and further analyze how much self or partner statements were remembered by our bilingual participants when no cues are provided. So next slide, please. Next slide, sir. Okay, here are the 3 findings of our research. Monolingual speakers make more errors when recalling partner statements. Bilingual speakers make more errors when recalling their own statements. And also Chinese English bilinguals recall significantly more content in conversation in their L1 than in their L2. So we have to mention the limitations of our research. We had a small sample of subjects, as Lily has mentioned before. So if we have the chance, we need to recruit more participants, especially monolingual English speakers, and also English as L1, Chinese as L2 speakers, since our bilingual participants included in our project were all L1 Chinese speakers. And another limitation of our research will be the mode of our experiment. As mentioned earlier in our experiment, as mentioned earlier, our experiment was conducted remotely. So the conversation task in this project might not mimic the real conversations in our daily lives. But however, we have tried our best to set up our experiments similar to the in-person ones during the pandemic period. And yeah, and I think that's the end of our PIRE project presentation. We would like to thank you to NSF and PIRE for funding our research. Thank you to University of Granada and Beijing Normal University for collaboration and aid in recruiting participants. We have learned a lot from our excellent researchers, and we have developed many invaluable research skills as well as important soft skills. We would like to thank all of you for your support and guidance throughout our PIRE journey. And the next slides will be our references. Thank you so much.
Thank you.